Imagine stepping into the Valley of Mexico in the early 16th century. Before you rises a city unlike any other on earth, Tenochtitlan, the crown jewel of the Aztec Empire. It is a city built on water, a floating island of stone and canals, shimmering beneath the sun. Causeways stretch across the lake, linking this island metropolis to the surrounding world. Thousands of canoes glide through the canals like blood through veins, bringing goods, warriors, and captives into the heart of the empire. The first impression is breathtaking. Dazzling white temples rising above bustling markets, pyramids that pierce the clouds, and a sense of order, discipline, and majesty. But beneath the beauty, something darker pulses. Tenochtitlan is not merely a city, it is a living altar. Its heartbeat is sacrifice, its lifeblood is human blood. Every festival, every victory, every prayer is entwined with the shedding of life. The Aztecs believed their gods demanded nothing less. To them, blood was the sacred fuel of the cosmos. The sun itself, they feared, would fall from the sky unless fed with human hearts. Rain would not fall, crops would wither, the earth would die, unless life was offered up in ritual. This was not cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was cosmic necessity. And so, the city was built to serve both the living and the dead. In the very center of Tenochtitlan rose the Templo Mayor, the great temple. Its twin shrines, one to Huitzilopochtli, god of war and the sun, and the other to Tlaloc, god of rain, stood as eternal reminders that blood and sacrifice were the price of balance. From afar, the temple was magnificent. Up close, it was terrifying. For its steps were stained red, slick with centuries of ritual, a cascade of dried blood flowing down its stone face like a second river. Foreigners who first set eyes upon it could scarcely believe what they saw. For in Tenochtitlan, death was not hidden. It was celebrated, paraded, and enshrined. The people lived with the knowledge that life itself was fragile, borrowed, and might be taken in service of the gods at any moment. The markets of life and death. Walk deeper into the city, and you enter the Tlatelolco market, a sprawling expanse where tens of thousands gathered each day. Here, traders sold maize, cacao beans, jaguar skins, obsidian blades sharp enough to slice flesh with ease. And here, too, stood something more chilling. Stalls where the skulls of sacrificed victims were displayed, reminders of what awaited the defeated. To an Aztec, these displays were not grotesque curiosities. They were sacred trophies, proof of devotion and proof of the gods' favor. For every skull represented balance restored, chaos averted, the sun assured another day of life. Children grew up surrounded by these images. They played in the shadows of pyramids where captives were marched up to meet their fate. They watched festivals where entire families wept as loved ones were chosen for sacrifice. And in these moments, the children learned not to question, but to revere. For in Aztec belief, to be sacrificed was not shameful. It was the highest honor. The living heart of the empire. Tenochtitlan was a machine that thrived on conquest. Warriors swept out across Mesoamerica, not only to expand territory, but to capture prisoners for the festivals. To kill an enemy on the battlefield was a waste. The true glory was in capturing him alive. The greater the rank of the captive, the greater the honor when his heart was lifted to the gods. As such, war and religion were inseparable. Every battle was fought with festivals in mind. Every victory was measured not only in land gained, but in blood to be spilled upon the Templo Mayor's steps. For the Aztec calendar was rich with rituals. Each month brought its own festival. Each festival demanded its own victims. To live in Tenochtitlan was to live in the rhythm of sacrifice, to hear the drums of death echoing across the city like thunder. A city of contradictions. What makes Tenochtitlan so haunting is the paradox it embodied. On one hand, it was a marvel of engineering, home to gardens that floated upon the lake, aqueducts that carried fresh water, palaces adorned with gold. Its people were artists, poets, philosophers, and astronomers who gazed at the stars with wonder. Yet at the same time, They believed those stars themselves demanded blood. The same hands that carved delicate turquoise masks also flayed human skin to wear during rituals. The same voices that composed poems of love also chanted as obsidian blades cut into living chests. It was a civilization of beauty and horror, wisdom and savagery, forever bound together. The festival atmosphere picture the city during one of its grand festivals. The air thrums with the sound of drums, flutes, and conch shells. Thousands gather in the plaza, their faces painted, their voices raised in chants. Processions march through the streets, priests clad in jaguar skins, dancers adorned with feathers, captives bound in ropes, their eyes wide with fear or resignation. Torches flicker. The smell of copal incense mixes with the copper tang of blood. High above, the priests prepare the altars. The crowd roars as the first victim is led up the temple steps. From below, all eyes watch. Children on their fathers' shoulders strain to see. Mothers clasp their hands in prayer. Warriors stand proudly, awaiting the moment when the gods will be fed. Then the drums reach a fever pitch. The obsidian blade flashes. The chest splits open. A heart is lifted skyward, still beating, offered to the sun. The crowd erupts in ecstasy, for once again, the cycle is renewed. Whispers of fear. Yet beneath the celebration, there is always fear. For though the people believe sacrifice keeps the world alive, each person knows that one day it could be them. The prisoner, the warrior, even the child, all lives belong to the gods. The city thrives on blood, but blood is finite. The empire must expand, must conquer, must bring in more captives. For without them, the festivals cannot be fed. And without the festivals, the gods will turn their wrath upon the Aztecs themselves. Thus, Tenochtitlan stands as both paradise and prison, a jewel of the world, and a city forever drenched in crimson. To understand the bloody festivals of the Aztec Empire, one must first understand the gods who demanded them. The Aztec world was not one of gentle divinities or merciful heavens. Their gods were powerful, volatile, and insatiably hungry. To the Aztecs, these deities had built and destroyed worlds before, and unless constantly appeased, they could tear this fragile reality apart again. At the center of it all stood Huitzilopochtli, the god of the sun and war, the patron of Tenochtitlan itself. He was the god who had guided the Mexica people on their long migration to the Valley of Mexico, the one who had whispered into the ears of their priests to settle where an eagle perched on a cactus, devouring a serpent. To the Aztecs, Huitzilopochtli was the very embodiment of their destiny, conquerors chosen to keep the sun alive. But there was a price. Every day as the sun rose, the Aztecs believed it fought against the forces of darkness, and every evening, as it sank beneath the horizon, the sun was wounded, dying. Without nourishment, without strength, it might fail to rise again. Huitzilopochtli demanded blood, not metaphorical sacrifice, not offerings of grain or gold, but the real, pulsing hearts of men and women. Only by feeding him human lives could the sun be strong enough to continue its eternal journey across the sky. Then there was Tlaloc, the ancient god of rain, thunder, and fertility. Unlike Huitzilopochtli, whose demands were fueled by war and glory, Tlaloc's hunger was more sinister. He craved the tears of children. For the Aztecs, water was life. Without it, crops failed, famine struck, and death crept over the land. To please Tlaloc, they sacrificed boys and girls in ceremonies so cruel that even the priests admitted their cries were necessary. The sound of children weeping was said to gladden Tlaloc's heart and ensure rainfall. If the children did not cry, the priests would make sure they did, sometimes breaking fingernails or causing pain before the ritual. Their agony was not only accepted but celebrated, for in those tears lay the survival of the people. Beyond them loomed Tezcatlipoca, the god of night, sorcery, and destiny. Known as the Smoking Mirror, he was both a creator and a destroyer, a trickster whose whims could lift empires or shatter them. His festivals required men to live as his earthly representatives for an entire year, pampered and worshipped, only to be sacrificed at the height of their glory. For the Aztecs, this was not cruelty, but the ultimate honor, to walk as a god on earth before surrendering life to the blade. And there was Totec, our Lord the Flayed One, whose rituals were among the most gruesome of all. Totec represented renewal, rebirth through suffering. His priests wore the flayed skins of sacrificial victims, draped like loose clothing over their own bodies. The rotting flesh would hang and stink for days as the priests carried out ceremonies, the skin gradually peeling away until it fell off completely, symbolizing the cycle of death and regeneration. Together, these gods formed a pantheon unlike any other, a divine order in which blood was the currency of existence. To the Aztecs, sacrifice was not evil. It was duty. It was the very mechanism by which the universe kept turning. Without sacrifice, the rains would fail, the sun would die, the crops would wither, and the world would collapse into chaos. When we look at the Aztec Empire today, it is easy to see only the horror, the staggering number of lives taken on the steps of pyramids, the rivers of blood that flowed down the stone. But to them, these festivals were sacred obligations. Each heart cut from a chest was not just death. It was the promise of another sunrise. Each tear of a sacrificed child was not merely grief. It was the gift of rain. The gods demanded blood, and the Aztecs gave it willingly, building an empire on the foundation of fear, devotion, and ritual slaughter. And in the heart of Tenochtitlan, with the towering pyramid of the Templo Mayor, these gods watched, waiting for their due. The Aztec Empire did not stumble into bloodshed blindly. Every drop spilled, every heart cut from a chest, every cry offered to the heavens was planned, calculated, and woven into the very rhythm of their world. Theirs was a civilization run on a calendar that was not just a measure of time, but a sacred machine for sacrifice. The Aztecs used two intertwined calendars. One was the Tonalpohualli, a 260-day ritual cycle divided into 20 periods of 13 days. This was the heartbeat of their spiritual life, guiding divinations, births, destinies, and rituals. The other was the Xiuhpohualli, the 365-day solar calendar, aligned with the seasons and agriculture. Together, they created a repeating 52-year cycle, known as the bundling of years. To the Aztecs, this cycle was more than an astronomical coincidence. It was a countdown to potential annihilation. At the end of every 52 years, the gods might decide to end the world unless appeased with grand sacrifice. Each festival within this calendar carried its own dark splendor. The Aztecs did not sacrifice haphazardly. They orchestrated bloodletting with precision, aligning it to the seasons, the harvest, and the moods of their gods. In the month of Tlacaxipehualistli, they honored Totec. Captives were dressed as the god, painted bright yellow, and forced to duel Aztec warriors in rigged battles where they were guaranteed to lose. Once defeated, their skin was flayed, and priests wore it like cloaks. Villagers would touch the hanging flesh for blessings, believing it brought fertility to the fields. During Toxcatl, Tezcatlipoca's month, a young man chosen for his beauty and perfection lived as the goddess double for an entire year. He walked through the city with flowers, women, and respect lavished upon him. He played flutes as he wandered, his every desire met. But when the month ended, he climbed the steps of the Great Pyramid, broke his flute, and surrendered his body to the knife. His sacrifice was both tragic and awe-inspiring. A life lived as a god, cut short at the peak of glory. In Quetzalcoatlistli, dedicated to Tlaloc, children were the chosen victims. Priests selected them carefully, sometimes from noble families, other times from commoners, but always with one requirement: they had to weep. As the ceremonies began, their tears streamed down their faces, and the onlookers cheered, for tears meant rain. Without them, drought and famine loomed. The children were led up the mountain, their cries echoing across the valley before their blood was spilled for the god of water. And then there was Panquetzalistli, the month of Huitzilopochtli, the sun god. This was the grandest of all festivals, a season of war and tribute. Aztec armies swept into neighboring territories, capturing prisoners to bring home. In Tenochtitlan, thousands were lined up. Each led up the steps of the Templo Mayor, where priests awaited with obsidian blades. One after another, their chests were split, hearts raised high, and bodies tumbled down the stone steps, their blood painting the pyramid red. Drums thundered, shells blared, and dancers stamped their feet in rhythm to the endless cycle of killing. The scale of sacrifice was staggering. During the dedication of the Templo Mayor in 1487, chroniclers recorded that as many as 20,000 victims were sacrificed in a single festival. For the Aztecs, this calendar was life. It dictated when to plant, when to fight, when to celebrate, and when to kill. Each festival was not only an offering but a reenactment of cosmic battles, keeping the universe in motion. They saw themselves as participants in a drama far larger than their empire, guardians of a fragile balance between creation and destruction. The sacred calendar ticked on, each month another reminder that the gods were watching, waiting, hungry. And so the Aztec people lived in cycles of feasts and sacrifices, their days punctuated not by hours or minutes, but by the rhythm of death and renewal. Before the festivals of blood, before the drums thundered atop the pyramids, there was the march of the captives. For the Aztec Empire, war was not fought only for land or wealth, it was waged to feed the gods. The flower wars, ritual battles between the Aztecs and their neighbors, such as Tlaxcala, Huexotzinco, and Cholula, were not wars of conquest. They were carefully arranged hunts for living bodies. Warriors clashed with obsidian blades and spears, but their true aim was not to kill. Death on the battlefield was wasteful. What the Aztecs wanted were prisoners. To capture an enemy alive was the highest honor a warrior could achieve. Young warriors were trained from boyhood to strike not to slay, but to disable. With swift movements, they used their shields and clubs to knock opponents off balance, ensnaring them with ropes and dragging them from the battlefield. Capturing 4 enemies was the mark of a great warrior, a step toward becoming an eagle or jaguar knight, the elite of the Aztec military. Once captured, prisoners were bound with cords, their arms lashed behind their backs. They were marched back to Tenochtitlan in long, sorrowful lines. The people of the city would gather along the causeways, watching as the captives shuffled forward under the harsh sun, their fates sealed. Some were nobles taken in grand battles. Others were peasants, young and trembling, plucked from villages unlucky enough to be raided. But no matter their rank, once inside the Aztec capital, they were transformed into offerings. Priests painted their faces black or red, adorning them with feathers, garlands, or costumes to resemble the gods they were meant to represent. For days, sometimes weeks, they were fed well, treated with a strange reverence. The Aztecs did not want their sacrifices weak or starved. The gods demanded vigor, strong hearts, and healthy blood. Yet the captives knew what awaited them. The stories of the Templo Mayor spread far beyond the empire. Tales of endless stairs slick with blood, of drums echoing across the valley, of bodies tumbling like rag dolls down the pyramid steps. These stories were whispered in conquered lands with fear and resignation. Some captives accepted their fate, believing that death upon the altar was not the end but a transformation. To die as a sacrifice meant joining the gods, soaring alongside the sun, or becoming a hummingbird in the afterlife. Others resisted to the last breath, screaming curses at their captors, struggling against the ropes as they were dragged up the steep steps. There was one ritual, especially cruel and spectacular, called the gladiatorial sacrifice. Here, a captive was tied to a circular stone in the center of the plaza. Armed only with a wooden sword embedded with dull feathers instead of obsidian, he faced a succession of Aztec warriors armed with real weapons. The outcome was inevitable. The captive fought valiantly, sometimes drawing cheers from the crowd, but he always fell, bleeding, broken, before being dragged to the altar. For the Aztecs, these scenes were not sadistic entertainment. They were divine necessity. The march of the captives was a march of time, the procession that turned men into offerings, warriors into God's nourishment. The blood of these prisoners would ensure that the sun rose again, that rain fell, that maize grew tall in the fields. And so, day after day, month after month, the captives marched. Their shadows stretched long across the stone roads of Tenochtitlan, reminders to the Aztec people that the empire's glory, its temples, its markets, its shimmering lake city, was built on a foundation of blood. At the center of Tenochtitlan, rising high above the lake city, stood the Templo Mayor, the great temple. Twin stairways climbed steeply toward twin shrines, one dedicated to Huitzilopochtli, god of war and the sun, and the other to Tlaloc, the rainbringer. It was here, on those stone heights, that the most feared and awe-inspiring ritual of the Aztec world took place, the heart extraction sacrifice. When the day of the festival arrived, drums began to thunder, deep, booming, rhythmic. Their sound rolled across the valley, echoing against mountains and carried by the wind over the shimmering lake. The people of Tenochtitlan gathered in the plaza below, tens of thousands pressing shoulder to shoulder, their faces lifted to the sky. The air was thick with incense, smoke curling upward in spirals, mingling with the coppery tang of blood that already clung to the steps. The captives were led up the steep staircases, one after another. Their bodies were painted, their heads crowned with feathers, their faces marked with chalk. Each was made to resemble a god, transformed for their final role. Some walked proudly, defiant even in the face of death. Others stumbled, their legs buckling under fear. Priests in long dark robes, their hair matted with dried blood, guided them toward the altar. The altar itself was a flat stone slab, worn smooth by centuries of sacrifice. At its edge, the chief priest stood with an obsidian blade, a tool as sharp as glass, its black surface glinting in the sun. This was no ordinary knife, but a weapon consecrated with blood. The captive was stretched across the stone, arms and legs held by 4 assistants. His chest heaved against the weight of terror, the drums beating faster, faster, until they seemed to merge with the pounding of his heart. And then, with a swift and practiced motion, the priest drove the obsidian blade into the chest. The cut was clean, searing, and sudden. The crowd below gasped as the priest's arm plunged deep, fingers grasping for the beating organ. Within seconds, the heart was lifted high into the air, still trembling, still pulsing. "To the sun!" the priest cried, offering the bloody heart to Huitzilopochtli. The crowd roared, a deafening wave of voices, while streams of blood coursed down the steps of the temple, painting the stone red. The heart was placed in a golden vessel, to burn as an offering, its smoke carried to the heavens. The lifeless body was not simply discarded. It was rolled down the steep temple stairs, tumbling and bouncing, limbs twisting unnaturally, until it came to rest in the plaza below. There, attendants gathered the bodies, some to be buried, others to be skinned for rituals, and still others to be cooked and served in ceremonial feasts for the nobility. On great festivals, hundreds of captives were sacrificed in a single day. Chronicles from Spanish conquistadors claim that during the dedication of the Templo Mayor in 1487, as many as 20,000 men were sacrificed over 4 days, their hearts torn out in a frenzy of ritual slaughter. Whether that number is inflated or not, the truth remains staggering. The temple steps became rivers of blood, slick and dangerous, while the air filled with the smell of burning flesh and incense. For the Aztecs, there was no horror in this. To them, it was sacred duty, the most vital of all acts. Each heart torn from a chest was another spark of energy cast into the sun, another assurance that the cosmic struggle would continue, that the world would not collapse into darkness. And yet, for the prisoners, for the witnesses from foreign lands forced to watch their kin die, it was a vision of terror beyond imagining. The Templo Mayor stood not only as a monument to Aztec devotion, but as a tower of fear, a reminder that the empire's strength rested on endless sacrifice. Not all sacrifices in the Aztec Empire were warriors captured in battle. Some were children, innocent, small, trembling, chosen for the god who demanded tears as much as blood, Tlaloc, the rainbringer. For the Aztecs, rain was life. Without it, Maize withered, rivers shrank, and famine spread. Tlaloc, the powerful and capricious god of water, was said to live in the mountains, where he stored clouds in great jars. But he was a cruel deity. To please him, the Aztecs offered not just animals or flowers, but the most precious of all gifts, children. Every year during the festival of Atlcawalo, groups of boys and girls, often no older than 6 or 7, were chosen from across the empire. Some were the children of conquered peoples, given up as tribute. Others were purchased, and sometimes, though rarely, even offered voluntarily by Aztec families who believed such sacrifice would bring divine favor. The children were dressed in fine garments, adorned with beads and feathers. Their faces were painted blue, the color of water and the heavens. Priests and attendants led them in solemn processions through the streets of Tenochtitlan, while crowds watched in silence. But unlike other sacrifices, there was something uniquely harrowing about this ritual. The priests wanted the children to weep. Their tears, the Aztecs believed, were omens of rain. The more they cried, the greater the blessing Tlaloc would send. And so, as they were carried up to the temple, their sobs echoed against the stone. Mothers in the crowd sometimes wept too, knowing what was about to happen. At the summit, the ritual was swift. The obsidian blade flashed once more, cutting small chests open to lift hearts skyward. Sometimes the bodies were buried in fields, their blood mixing with soil to fertilize crops. Other times, they were cast into sacred springs or caves, believed to be gateways to Tlaloc's watery realm. Chroniclers wrote that in some years, dozens, even hundreds, of children were sacrificed to call the rains. One Spanish friar recorded that during times of drought, the Aztecs believed only the blood of the young could break the heavens open. The tears of children became the very rivers that watered the earth. For the Aztecs, these ceremonies were acts of devotion, tragic yet necessary. Without water, life would vanish. Better to give a few so that the many could survive. But to outsiders, to anyone unbound by Aztec faith, it was a scene of unbearable horror. Tiny bodies carried lifeless from the temples, their cries silenced forever. The festival of Tlaloc revealed the deepest paradox of Aztec religion. An empire of dazzling sophistication and beauty that nonetheless believed the universe itself was balanced only by sacrifice. Even the most innocent, even the youngest, were not spared the gods' hunger. The sacrifices atop the temples were not the end of the ritual. For the Aztecs, the body of the victim was more than a lifeless shell. It was sacred flesh, imbued with divine power. To consume it was to consume the gods themselves. Thus began one of the most disturbing traditions of the empire, ritual cannibalism. After the heart had been torn free and lifted to the sun, the body was rolled down the steps of the Templo Mayor, thudding against the stone until it landed in the plaza below. There, attendants swiftly gathered the corpses. Some were flayed, their skins worn by priests in gruesome ceremonies symbolizing the renewal of life. Others were prepared for feasting. But this was not cannibalism of hunger. The Aztecs had food in abundance: maize, beans, squash, and even game from surrounding lands. No, this was spiritual consumption. The flesh of the sacrificed was seen as a gift from the gods, eaten in small portions by the nobility and warriors who had captured the victims. The bodies were taken to designated houses where they were cut apart with obsidian knives. The limbs were boiled or roasted, often served with maize and chili, transforming the meal into a sacred stew called tlacatlaoli, man's maize. To share in such a dish was to participate directly in the divine covenant of sacrifice. Only certain people could partake. Commoners rarely tasted human flesh. It was reserved for priests, rulers, and the warriors who had earned the honor by capturing the victim. For them, eating even a small piece of flesh was proof of their valor and devotion. Some sources suggest that the meat was served in ceremonial banquets, where nobles reclined as if at a feast of gods, consuming what they believed was the very essence of divinity. The Spanish chroniclers who witnessed these practices recoiled in horror. To them, it was evidence of savagery beyond redemption. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, a soldier under Cortés, wrote of finding pots of human flesh being stewed with maize. He could not imagine that such refined and intelligent people could also be cannibals. Yet for the Aztecs, the act was not barbarism, but holiness. They did not believe they were eating mere human meat. They believed they were eating the gods themselves, incarnated in the bodies of those who had been sacrificed. To chew, to swallow, was to absorb divine strength, to bind themselves tighter to the cosmos. There was also a political meaning. When captives from rival states were sacrificed and their flesh consumed, it symbolized dominance, the empire literally devouring its enemies. A conquered foe was not just defeated in life but consumed in death, his body dissolved into the blood and bones of the very people who ruled him. Imagine the scene. A banquet hall in Tenochtitlan, torches casting flickering light across stone walls. Nobles sit in silence as steaming bowls are passed among them. A priest raises his hand in blessing. Warriors dip their spoons into the stew, their faces solemn. They are not dining for pleasure, but for the gods. Every bite is a vow, every swallow an oath, every taste a renewal of the blood contract between men and the heavens. It was terrifying, it was sacred, and for the Aztecs, it was utterly necessary. In the heart of Tenochtitlan, towering above the bustling markets and shimmering canals, stood the Templo Mayor, the great temple. To the Aztecs, it was the axis of the universe, the point where the heavens, the earth, and the underworld converged. But to outsiders, it was something far darker, a mountain of blood, a monument to endless sacrifice. The temple itself was massive, with twin stairways rising steeply side by side. One staircase led to the shrine of Huitzilopochtli, the god of war and the sun. The other climbed toward the shrine of Tlaloc, the god of rain and fertility. At their summits, stone altars awaited victims, their surfaces permanently stained dark with centuries of blood. But the true horror lay not only in the ceremonies performed there, but in what surrounded the temple, the Tzompantli, the skull rack. Imagine a great wooden frame stretching long across the plaza, studded with horizontal poles. Upon these poles were mounted thousands of human skulls, bleached by the sun, their hollow eyes staring endlessly into the crowd. Each skull was drilled through the temples, threaded onto the wooden beams like macabre beads. When one rack filled, another was built. The Tzompantli became a wall of death, a grisly testament to the power of the empire. Spanish conquistadors who first entered the city were staggered. Bernal Diaz del Castillo recalled seeing a tower built entirely of skulls, and mortar, so many that we could not count them. Archaeological excavations in modern Mexico City have uncovered evidence of these very racks, confirming that they may have held tens of thousands of skulls. For the Aztecs, the skull rack was not only intimidation, though it certainly terrified enemies and foreigners alike. It was also a sacred symbol. Each skull was an offering, a proof that the people of Tenochtitlan had fed the gods and kept the cosmos alive. To walk past the Tzompantli was to be reminded of the delicate balance of existence and of the price paid to maintain it. The Tower of Skulls was also a political weapon. Envoys from rival states were led before it, forced to behold the silent faces of those who had once been warriors like themselves. The message was unmistakable. Resist the Aztec Empire, and your skull too will join the wall. At night, under the flickering glow of torches, the Tzompantli cast long, eerie shadows across the plaza. The hollow sockets seemed to watch the city, as though the dead themselves bore witness to the rituals. Some believed the spirits of the sacrificed hovered near, bound to the place where their flesh had been consumed and their bones displayed. The Templo Mayor and its Tower of Skulls were the ultimate symbols of Aztec devotion and Aztec terror. To the people of the empire, they were reminders of cosmic duty, of the gods' hunger and humanity's debt. To outsiders, they were nightmares made stone and bone. And yet to stand before them was to understand the heart of the empire itself. a civilization that had built wonders of architecture, astronomy, and art, but at its very core, pulsing beneath the surface of its greatness, was blood. When Hernán Cortés and his men first laid eyes on Tenochtitlan in 1519, they were struck with awe. Rising from the middle of a vast lake, the city gleamed with temples, palaces, markets, and causeways that seemed more advanced than anything in Europe. But their wonder quickly turned to horror when they discovered what truly sustained this empire: ritual blood. Bernal Díaz del Castillo, one of Cortés's companions, wrote in his memoirs of the sights that haunted him. He described temples where the stench of blood and burnt flesh filled the air, altars where thick crusts of gore clung to the stone, and idols of gods that were smeared with clotted offerings. The conquistadors were hardened men, veterans of war, but many admitted that the sheer brutality of the Aztec sacrifices left them shaken. What disturbed them most was the scale. They had seen war, famine, and death before, but never an empire where killing was not only constant, but ritualized, celebrated, and woven into every part of life. When Cortés was shown the Tzompantli, the Wall of Skulls, he reportedly stood speechless. Before him stretched thousands upon thousands of human heads, bleached white under the sun. Some of his men muttered prayers, others clutched their rosaries. They believed they were standing in the heart of hell itself. Yet the Spanish were not merely horrified, they were also fascinated. To them, the Aztec devotion to sacrifice seemed both barbaric and strangely disciplined, as if the entire empire lived under the shadow of sacred violence. They noted the precision with which hearts were cut, the ceremony with which bodies were rolled down the temple steps, and the order in which skulls were cleaned, drilled, and mounted. It was savagery, but savagery ritualized into something greater. Still, the conquistadors also saw an opportunity. To the Spanish mind, the blood-soaked festivals were proof that the Aztecs were pagans in desperate need of salvation and conquest. They framed their war not only as a quest for gold and empire, but as a divine mission to end what they called devil worship. But even as they claimed righteousness, the Spanish used the Aztec rituals to justify their own brutalities. They massacred dancers during festivals, enslaved survivors, and burned temples. To them, the horror of the sacrifices became both reason and excuse for unleashing horrors of their own. Ironically, some conquistadors admitted to a grim admiration for the Aztec warriors who faced death willingly. They marveled at captives who walked calmly to the altar, who chanted hymns even as the obsidian blade descended. These men, they realized, were not broken slaves, but warriors offering their lives with honor, a kind of courage even seasoned soldiers could not easily comprehend. For the Spanish, witnessing the blood-soaked festivals was like staring into another world, one where faith demanded not prayer, but flesh, not hymns, but screams. It was a world that terrified them, but also made them more determined than ever to bring it down. And yet, as much as they sought to erase it, the memory of what they saw, the towering temples, the walls of skulls, the rivers of blood, would linger. It would haunt their writings, their dreams, and their stories for centuries to come. As the Spanish campaign advanced, the great city of Tenochtitlan began to unravel. The empire that once terrified its enemies with the thunder of drums and the rivers of sacrifice now faced a new kind of terror: gunpowder, steel, and disease. When Cortés returned with allied indigenous armies, the Aztecs fought with the same fury that had defined their rituals. Warriors charged into battle adorned with jaguar skins and eagle feathers, chanting prayers to gods who demanded blood. But this time, no offering could satisfy them. The skies brought not rain, but smallpox, carried unknowingly by the Spanish, and entire neighborhoods withered under the invisible plague. Inside the temples, the priests prayed desperately. They offered sacrifice after sacrifice, believing that if they fed the gods more blood, the sun would rise in their favor, and the invaders would be driven back. Captives were dragged up the steps, hearts lifted toward the heavens, blood running in desperate streams. Yet no miracle came. By 1521, Tenochtitlan was besieged. The once vast city became a battlefield of fire and famine. Spanish cannons tore through walls, ships cut off supplies across the lake, and hunger gnawed at the population. Even then, the rituals did not stop. Priests continued their chants, blood continued to spill, but the people began to despair. When the city finally fell, the great temple of Huitzilopochtli, once drenched in sacrifice, was stormed by Spanish soldiers. They tore down the idols, smashed the altars, and cast the sacred stones into rubble. The blood festivals that had defined an empire for centuries ended in a storm of fire, steel, and screams. But though the rituals ceased, the memory endured. The conquistadors wrote of what they had seen, blending horror with fascination. They spoke of towers of skulls, of rivers of blood, of festivals where the earth shook beneath the drums. Over time, those accounts spread across Europe, painting the Aztec Empire as both magnificent and monstrous. For the descendants of the Aztecs, the story was more complicated. The blood festivals were both a legacy of devotion and a burden of shame, remembered with awe and fear. Some viewed them as the height of cultural glory, a civilization so dedicated to its gods that it gave everything. Others saw them as proof of how faith, when consumed by fear, can turn into madness. Today, archaeologists still uncover fragments of that lost world. Skull racks unearthed from beneath the streets of Mexico City, sacrificial knives hidden in the ruins, murals stained with ancient red pigment. Each discovery whispers of a time when blood was not just life but the language of the divine. The fall of the blood festivals marked the end of an empire, but not the end of its shadow. Even now, the story of the Aztec sacrifices lingers in the imagination. Haunting, mesmerizing, terrifying. A reminder that humanity, in its search for meaning, has always been willing to offer the most precious thing it possesses, life itself. And so the drums have gone silent, the altars stand in ruins, and the gods no longer receive their offerings. But the memory of the blood-soaked festivals of the Aztec Empire still beats, faintly, like a distant heart echoing across history.